Ladies and gentlemen, I think that we should begin our concluding session. I think it's the prophet Isaiah who speaks of the remnant, isn't it? The saving remnant. Well, that's us. Victoria College, perhaps the whole University of Toronto, is always silent on a Saturday like a tomb. There'll be a strange contrast this morning to the other days with students milling in the hall and workmen pounding outside. We even have the blessing of a sympathetic breeze, which is appropriate as well. And there's this wonderful sense of the morning after. I suppose some would say it's not so wonderful, but still. The panel is diverse and will be approaching the topic of the entire colloquium with an appropriate sense of individual perspective. The order of speakers has been adjusted at the last minute because Professor Valdez has gone over to Robarts Library to make Xerox copies of a handout for Professor Mcluhan. And in order that we have the time for Professor Valdez to get back, we will begin with Professor Dimich. It seems appropriate that Professor Cohen be the final speaker on the panel. And before introducing the individual speakers, I would remind you that in a sense this session is also yours. Above all, I would welcome comments from the floor following the presentations, not only in the form of response to the statements this morning, but in response to the entire colloquium. And they need not be in the form of questions. They can be, as it were, meta-criticism of whatever kind. And we are not obliged, of course, to conclude at noon, but I assume we will conclude for lunch. And the sense of a community of discourse is I hope, what we all seek to achieve. Well, let me turn to Professor Milan Dimich from the Department of Comparative Literature at the University of Alberta. He is known within the field in Canada as perhaps the one person most responsible for creating it and keeping it alive. He is the editor of our journal. He has been very active in our association. He is even engaged in the political affairs of Ottawa on behalf of not only comparative literature, but the academic profession. I'm very glad he was able to come to be with us with his wife, and I'm happy to turn the floor over to him.
Thank you.
You don't mind speaking without a mic?
No.
Should I put it? Okay.
You will see how it sounds. I think some people who will not be able to follow my little talk will prefer it probably that way. I will attempt some thoughts about the history and theory of literature as a historical institution. Professor David Hoy's pleading for hermeneutic awareness of oneself encourages me to approach the question of the historicity of the theoreticians of literary history and their own belonging to an institution. Most of my reflections will seem, by necessity, both obvious and impertinent. Obvious because they evoke facts known to all practitioners of our trade. Impertinent because most of these same practitioners seem to prefer to assume for themselves a loftier, if not absolute, standpoint. To attenuate the obviousness, I will therefore introduce a little later a few examples which are perhaps less present in everybody's mind. And to alleviate the impertinence, I will assume that even when some of my rhetorical invocations seem to address themselves to us here, the subjects in this very room, in our empirically concrete existence, those I really have in mind are of course elsewhere, absent and for this reason a more justifiable object of discourse. You may think of Cicero's example in his Tusculaneum Transactions, where he says we are here sitting in Puteoli in a particular room, drinking a particular wine, looking at the hills of Rome. But imagine now that the same us are sitting in another identical room, looking at the same landscape, drinking an identical wine and so on. And I'm really speaking about these other us and not about ourselves. Let me glance at this hall, using it metaphorically and metonymically, but not realistically, for other halls of learning somewhere else. You may be reminded, by the way, if you are a scholar in Germanic studies, that the Fürst von Bülow unwittingly probably was for the only time in his life witty when he addressed a Germanisten-Tagung and said, meine Herren, of course, not meine Damen und Herren, meine Herren, ich habe noch nie einen Saal so voller Lehren gesehen. We are in a building belonging to an institution of what is called higher learning, funded by public monies in Canada, North America. We are professional teachers and scholars of literature, surrounded by other scholars and teachers and would-be scholars and teachers. There are probably not too many creative poets here, and almost assuredly there are no manual laborers and illiterates. We come from different national educational backgrounds, have particular conscious and unconscious beliefs, intellectual and temperamental distinctions, but a closer look would show that we all frequented universities of the Western type and universities predominantly subscribing to so-called Humboldt ideals and structures, that we learned from teachers who went to similar schools, that we passed competitive examinations, obtained certain kinds of documents, opening doors to union certification and job opportunity, and that we have engaged in research in the production of examples of discursive scholarship acceptable to learned journals and university and other scholarly presses. Our alma mater usually stood and still stands for the Judeo-Christian tradition, and our choice of profession, how very revealing, by the way, are such terms as profession, professor, and discipline. Our choice of métier and the way we exercise it implies that we opted for the particular continuity, discontinuity, stretching from Vico to Winkelmann, to Hegel to Marx, and from Schleiermacher and Friedrich Schlegel to Dilthey to Gadamer, and why not, even to Derrida, as explained to us by Professor Hartmann, and that we rejected by this very act other alternative continuities, discontinuities, as for instance that proposed by Schopenhauer, Kierkegaard, and Nietzsche. For Schopenhauer, history lacks, I am quoting, the essential character of a science, the subordination of the known, instead of which history can only coordinate the known. And I continue the quote, she is therefore knowledge, but no science. Because nowhere does history comprehend the particular through the general, but it has always to understand directly the particular, and in this way to remain at the level of experience. End of quote. For Kierkegaard, the approximative character of historical knowledge not only destroys its claim to be a science, but even imperils our soul, because in his words, the historical truth is incommensurable with an eternal decision. Writing in 1874, Nietzsche does not deny anymore the possibility of a Geschichte als Wissenschaft, history as a science, and while he is not bothered by the thought that man loses his soul when he trusts historians, he still believes that scholarly history is useless and pernicious to life. He asks, wozu überhaupt eine wissenschaftlich betriebene Geschichte, and underlines the wozu, why, and the wissenschaftlich scholarly. Why at all a scholarly study of history? It is to him, poisonous enterprise especially when history attacks itself to, quote, transcendental powers which divert our gaze from the becoming to that which lends eternal and unchanging features to our existence, to art and religion underlined by Nietzsche. Beyond similarities in cultural codes, social situation, educational backgrounds, and certain basic philosophical, not to say ideological options, we all belong also to a tradition and a system, or more precisely to interrelated traditions and systems of a particular scholarly discipline. Whether we behave like obedient children, or whether we are killing our fathers and discovering our uncles, to use Shklovsky's striking image mentioned yesterday by Professor Stritter, we all have to cope with patterns of traditional choices and usages which range from literary texts, tools and methods of research to teaching practices, and with, quote, cemeteries brimmed full of corpses still wanting to speak, unquote, to use the words of Valéry Mephistopheles about libraries. And still, while being helped and hindered in our praxis by that of preceding generations of scholars, we are also limited by our own very human nature, which reduces us in time and space, in spiritual and emotional horizon, in life experience and language aptitudes. Because in some ways, we are not only far from Gilgamesh and Greek tragedy, as mentioned 2 days ago, of the oral world of so-called primitive tribes, and for that matter, of the European High Middle Ages, and not only from Far Eastern civilizations of the past, but we are also remote from today's other geographic spaces and alien cultural codes. To be less general and less obvious, may I introduce here a few examples taken almost at random, but on purpose of a different kind in each case, to show in a somewhat perhaps more provocative and controversial way what I mean by being preconditioned by the tradition and the usages of our own profession. The first example is the somewhat perennial problem, at least for comparatists, of Goethe and in general of German classic, Deutsche Klassik, versus German Romanticism. Comparatists, of course, have also known that in constructing a concept of a romantic movement or romantic period or romantic era, they have as well to cope, for instance, with the fact that most East European scholars, and especially the Soviet specialists, prefer to see many of their national phenomena in Romanticism as very particular and very different of those in Western Europe, and that, of course, especially Pushkin and Gogol, to most of them cannot reasonably be considered as romantics at all. And we quite easily conclude that this is because of their ideological preference for realism and for a revolutionary openness towards the future, while the Western Romanticism, especially of the Novalis, Coleridge, Wordsworth type, is then branded as turned towards the past and being reactionary, so that having to us explain this particular framework of their thought, we see, of course, the impact of their particular cultural and even political tradition and why this is creating difficulties. But what we, I think, see less well is that the problem of in what way Goethe and Hölderlin, and in the past even Kleist and Jean-Paul Friedrich Richter, can be or cannot be integrated into a general European concept of Romanticism. That this problem as well does not depend only on the particular features which do exist in Goethe's work and of course in Hölderlin's work, not even only on the textual level, but also on the biographical level. We know of certain relations and lacks of relations of Goethe with the Romantics and so on, that this is not the whole problem, but that also German scholars and those who are trained in a German environment have been exposed now for more than a century to a certain attitude, on one hand towards German classic, on the other towards German Romanticism, which is part of a particular Kulturkampf a struggle about the concept of what the national culture should be in German-speaking countries, and especially in North Germany. So that, to some extent, tradition has built up a myth of Goethe, a certain idolatry of the idyllic poetic genius, starting with at least Bettina von Arnim and Eckermann, leading then to the concept of Goethe as a national hero, and of Goethe's humanism as the healthy antidote against the self-destructive subjectivity and irrationality of Romanticism, which leads straight from Romanticism to Wagner, to Nietzsche, and even to fascism. And Lukács is not the only one who is establishing such filiations. So that for anybody who has been intimately exposed to a German tradition in scholarship, there is a major inner even barrier to be overcome before I think a new appraisal is possible, whether and to what extent and in what way Goethe and some of his so-called classic contemporaries do belong, to a certain extent at least, in a European concept of a Romantic era. The second example, which I will sketch for you even more briefly, is the history of reception and of successive readings of Cervantes' Don Quixote. As you know, for 2 centuries, to use a modern term, the intertextuality which was considered relevant was the relationship to the Amadis and to similar types of literature. It is again with the Romantics, especially with Friedrich Schlegel, with Ludwig Tieck and a few others, that a new intertextuality has been established, particularly with Shakespeare's Hamlet, for instance, and that Don Quixote and Sancho Panza are seen as almost metaphysical embodiments of certain life options and existential possibilities. This has been then continued in 19th century and 20th century literary criticism, literary scholarship, even in philosophical treatises, from Russian treatises to Spanish. And now it seems in the last 2 or 3 years there is again a very conscious effort on the part of some particularly English critics, it seems, to bring back the perspective to what they feel is the true initial perspective of a parody, of a satire, and not of a multidimensional metaphysical novel with the first signs, if you like, of romantic irony even in it, and so on. And again, an analysis could be made to show that this historical evolution of scholarship is to some extent predetermined by general cultural presuppositions of the different eras and of the needs of the cultural consumption of the product, so to speak, and not only by the fact that some scholars have the historical knowledge or that some scholars know how to read or that others do not. On a different level, an example of geographic and linguistics limitations influencing the development of literary scholarship and methodology is, of course, the history of the acceptance, and at first the non-acceptance, of Russian formalism, Czech structuralism, and even of Roman Ingarden in the West, the time lag between their existence in Russian, in Czech, in Polish, and in the case of some of the texts even in German, and their acceptance in French and English. We are speaking of a number of decades which have passed, and where obviously one of the major reasons was that their most relevant texts and the examples, especially the Czech structuralists, as we have heard from Professor Strita, have used to illustrate and justify and exemplify their theories, have not belonged to the cultural horizon of a Western critic. It may seem to this room bizarre, but we should add that there is another limitation, which seems to be the firmness of a certain tradition. While to us today it would seem evident that modern methodologies cannot be seen without this group of works, Even today in West Germany, of all places, a huge encyclopedia of the folktale is being published, which almost systematically relegates to footnotes, and very rare footnotes, any kind of structuralist, I'm using this in a loose sense, analysis of the folktale or the folk song. It's published by the best traditional scholars in folklore in Germany, by Walter de Gruyter. The general editorship is Lutz Röhrig, who is the director of the folklore archives in Freiburg. And only 4 years ago, they published with the Erich Schmidt Verlag a huge 2-volume compendium on folklore studies, particularly folk song, where they have one single footnote, where they give a number of names of important studies from Proc and Jolle to Bremont, and say we are not dealing with these people because they still have to prove that there is relevance in what they are doing to folklore studies. And triumphantly they march out the battalions of the Finno-Ugric school, of course. This is in 74. So there are obviously some differentiations in the scholarly community. Another example, and I'm giving it only as a little aside, intertextuality in literature, of course, is one of our main concerns, but what about intertextuality in literary scholarship? And especially, for instance, when it is a matter of nods and signs which declare our belonging to an imposed, in the sense, for instance, of an ideologically imposed, or a merely fashionable scholarly school. For instance, Marxism in many countries on the side of ideology, structuralism, semiotics, post-semiotics, sometimes linked with neo-Freudianism and neo-Marxism in the West, where teachers and students alike feel that they have to put in a few signs in their text, that they have read the appropriate passages in Lacan or in Grémard or in Jeannette or in something else, so that they are still à la page, that they are not overcome by the development of things. As in the East, one would quote Marx and Lenin on any kind of problem to show that one is where one belongs. On a more serious level, for instance, what is the real link between the present revision of what belongs to literature and the changing attitudes in modern visual arts, music, theater, and also with the erosion of the normative stance in the study and teaching of natural languages? There is, of course, a clear link, I would say, between trends in most recent methodological debates and in the evolution of epistemology and logic in philosophy and of systems and models in mathematics. One of the possible topics for a student paper, or perhaps even for a thesis, would be to analyze the historical role played by displaced persons, émigrés in general, by Jews, by people who have been raised in border areas or in so-called naturally bilingual and multicultural areas like the Alsace, for instance, or in Belgium, in Switzerland, in some countries of Central Europe, in the development of comparative literature, and to what extent comparative literature has been preconditioned by the type of person who statistically has most contributed to the elaboration of its theory. I have already bored you to death, I'm sure, but it seemed to me that this colloquium would not complete its course without reminding us of our position of dependence, so that we may better assume our inner freedom. I can still remember the naive and somewhat heady days when, quote, the beautiful, unquote, was a safe category belonging to truth and goodness, and, quote, pleasing without interest, was ohne Interesse gefällt, the late Kant, of course. I'm not aware of theories, but I may have missed some, of course, claiming the same intemporality and permanence for the literary historian and for the professional theoretician of literature. Thank you.
I can go straight ahead if you wish.
If you won't mind his circulating things as it will in the midst of things, I think perhaps we should press on.
Shall I get a start?
Let me say a few words.
I don't yet see Professor Valdez, but I think we should move on anyway. I'd like to take just a moment to offer a comment about our next speaker. I'm sure there's no need to introduce Marshall Mcluhan to you, but I've never had the chance to do it to anyone, so why not take the opportunity? Professor Mcluhan is the director of an Institute for Culture and Technology here at the University of Toronto. Mario, would you, having, was there more, several pages, or just one?
Oh, there's two.
Okay, we have, there's the first sheet, and then here's this, I'll take this one. Okay. Not enough for the panelists. There we are. There are two sheets.
You should be able to follow as well.
I'm sure it's appropriate in some way to be interrupted in mid-sentence in introducing Marshall Mcluhan, but I'll let him interpret that.
And apostille pieces.
At any rate, I would like to offer a sincere and I think serious remark here that in the nearly 10 years that I have been at Toronto and associated with the developing program in comparative literature, it has been a very gratifying and I suppose reassuring experience to observe the way in which sympathetic efforts from various sources gradually move together. And I hope that Professor Mcluhan will not feel it impertinent of me to say that he seems to be among our allies, and it has taken us too long to recognize it. The work which he has been doing here for several decades seems to me to have prepared a direction of inquiry which perhaps makes our own work a little easier. For that reason, I take particular personal pleasure in welcoming him to this colloquium. I'm very pleased that he was willing to join us at this concluding session. And perhaps with that, I might turn the table over to you.
I have been enjoying a great deal of the conference from the time of the arrival of Ralph Cohen, and have benefited enormously. What I'm going to do at the moment, instead of a preamble, is simply to invite you to consider a form of structure that I have been working with for some time in what I call the laws of the media. And they are on the page, some of the examples are on the page, the play of metaphors, which Mario Valdes and I rather hastily put down one day, and we can discuss that in a moment. But the discovery that I made was that in the case of every single word and in the case of every single artifact made in any culture, in any part of the world, there are four features, and they are metaphor, and they are in ratio. It doesn't matter what the artifact is, or whether it's hardware or software, they have these four features. Now, just what this implies, I have not theorized. These four features are percepts, not concepts. They are not theoretic. They are simply observed and reported, and we will shortly have a chance to discuss them together. The four features of metaphor, four-part metaphor, are in ratio. They're simultaneous. They're not sequential. They are in ratio, and they belong to every single human artifact. Money, for example, as an artifact, enhances the speed of transactions, obsolesces barter, retrieves potlatch, and flips into credit. A zipper enhances the speed of clasping. It obsolesces buttons and bows. It retrieves long flowing garments and flips into Velcro. It doesn't matter what kind of thing, there are 4 and only 4 features in every single human artifact. Now, you can't find another one, or you can't add anything or take anything away from those 4, which would seem to indicate that there is a structure that is inherent in this form. So it might be amusing to turn to some of the topics that have been in play during the conference, and some of the terms, and just see what happens to them when presented or looked at under the aspect of metaphor. And graffiti enhance the uttering of grievance. They release tension, pressure. They retrieve. There's always a retrieval feature. Something is brought back that was pushed out earlier in every case, and that is the tough one to find. It's the most elusive. It's phenomenological. It retrieves rivalry, one-upmanship, and flips into a collective art form. Hermeneutics enhance clarity, awareness of textual difficulty, obsolesce naivete, innocence, simplistic interpretation, retrieve depth, profundity, magic, and enhance, or rather flip into obscurity when pushed. It was diachronic. Mario and I did these off the cuff. We did not have any special order in mind. We just took them as they popped up. Diachronic enhances a development, a sense of the continuum. Obsolesces the acoustic or discontinuous. It retrieves awareness of tradition and flips into an inclusive awareness, a monistic awareness. Synchronic enhances focal intensity, concentration, obsolesces ground usurped by figure, and retrieves isolated minutiae, and flips into unfolding total awareness. Parole enhances attention, special utterance, obsolesces the distracting figure, larger parameters, retrieves body language, kinesics, and flips into noise, irrelevance. Semiotics enhances direction, obsolesces total field, retrieves the cryptic, the runic, the mysterious, and flips into anarchy. Genre enhances awareness of a particular structure, generic structure, obsolesces the user as figure, reader as figure, and retrieves the shamanistic origins of genre, the magical origins, and the remote ones, and flips into unique individual form when pushed. The novel enhances the real, the presentation of new reality, obsolesces romance, retrieves historic chronicle, flips into fantasy, science fiction. Literary form enhances structure, obsolesces improvisation, retrieves the replay, the echo, and flips into double plot, parallel structures, which are acoustic in form. Double plots are not connected, always parallel, always acoustic. Double plots enhance the emotion of multitude. When two actions go side by side, it's Yeats' phrase, you get the sense of universality. From the most trivial little story lines, you get this immense feeling of universality from a simple structure of double plot. That's a Yeats essay with that title. It enhances the emotion of multitude, it obsolesces concern with the individual, retrieves the sense of the wholeness of community, and flips into uniqueness. The tetrads, the play of metaphors, enhance, obsolesce, retrieve, and flip in all cases whatever. And I have yet to find a single artifact, word, or nonverbal form that does not have this particular structure. It's a four-part structure, it's a four-part metaphor, and unlike the metonymy, simile, synecdoche, and so on, which are all dialectical three-part structures, the four-part structure is not connected, is in ratio, is simultaneous. It might entertain you to try some for yourselves right now, on the spot. Would anybody wish to propose a term or anything at all that they would like to see put in metaphor form?
We have a volunteer.
Yeah.
One of these chairs.
A chair, yes, why not? A chair enhances what? It's you tell me, it enhances a position. It's, and I used to call it the ablative absolute of backside. A chair obsolesces what? Sprawling or
Motion. It obsolesces motion.
It arrests motion. It what does it bring back, or that had been pushed out of the picture earlier, before chair?
Repose.
Repose. What does it flip into when pushed all the way to its extreme fixity?
Waterbed.
The womb.
Which one? Tenure. Oh, hear the word. What?
Tenure. Academic
You are
tenure.
speaking of chairs or
In his book, The Rule of Metaphor, Paul Ricoeur announces that is a metaphor. And he doesn't find the four parts. He tends to be a triad man. And anyway, what does is enhance as word?
No. Equivalence, what could be?
Or it could be the actuality. Enhances the actual. It obsolesces I suppose the discontinuous, anyway, it flips into is not. When pushed all the way, it becomes is not, which is the one of the points that Paul Ricoeur was insisting on.
What does it retrieve?
Yes, what does it retrieve?
There was. The is retrieves the was.
The was?
W-A-S.
W-A-S?
To is retrieved by what is. It's a state of being, not doing something that precedes. So it retrieves something that's already done.
What had been? The was. Does that seem to be acceptable, that it retrieves the was?
Retrieves itself.
Itself? You're using that in a omniscient form. What comes back? Every single word, every single form brings back something that had been pushed out earlier. A motor car, for example, retrieves knights in shining armor. The figure of the driver becomes a knight in shining armor. But this is not the easy. As I say, the number 3 is the difficult one. It's elusive and often takes a while to track down or perceive. By the way, these, I hope you agree, are percepts, not concepts. There are no theories whatever in these ratios or in these observations. They're entirely perceptual without any theoretic basis. And there are no concepts involved. I discovered when I was presenting this to a French group that there is no word in French for percept, only concepts, which would indicate the bias of the language. But are there any other words you'd like to try?
Percept.
All right. What does a percept enhance? It is enhances a particular awareness. It's not a general awareness. And it obsolesces the ground in favor of figure. All right, it enhances figure and obsolesces ground. And what does it retrieve?
Concept? That's what it flips into.
Flips into concept. Yeah. Not sure what it retrieves.
The optic.
It depends probably whether we are Platonicians or Aristotelians.
No, it has nothing to do with concepts. It has to do only with percepts.
Until it flips.
Until it flips.
Yeah. There are no theoretic basis for this, these observations. By the way, remember Aristotle said you cannot teach metaphor. It's based on sheer ability to perceive. Unteachable.
There's another question.
The intertextuality.
Yeah.
Is there any correspondence between these 4 laws and fourfold allegory?
Oh yes, the 4 levels are here. They are the 4 levels. They are also the 4 causes. By the way, this is reception theory. I forgot to mention that. No, this is formal. These 4 are formal causality, not efficient causality. These 4 represent the structure of formal cause, and they are the very nature of reception theory. Reception theory is based entirely on this pattern, this structure. It is alien to the Western world in general to study percepts in place of concepts. The people of the phonetic alphabet prefer concepts to percepts. And there has been very little study of, for example, Aristotle's public or Plato's readers or Dante's readers, very little reception theory in English literature or in any literature in the West. So the rise of reception theory is rather astonishing. These four aspects are the effect, they're a study of effects that forms have on consciousness. These four represent the effects on consciousness of any particular thing. Formal causality is entirely concerned with effects, no value judgments possible. Formal cause is overall field. Has nothing to do with any particular point of view. No value judgments. I have a friend in cancer research, Dr. Mcluhan, who uses these four aspects in order to test the therapies he's using in cancer therapy. And he knows when he goes through those four, he knows when he's on the wrong track. He knows what it will flip into when pushed too far. But you can predict, in other words, the use of the three and the 3 and 4 give you a predictive power. You can predict what will happen if you use that form. Yes, this is reception theory. This, I think, is the first time that formal cause has ever been explained. That is, exclamation. That was efficient. Efficient cause, not formal. Your reception of that was formal cause. The thing itself was efficient cause. The formal cause has to do with the overall effect of any presentation. The audience is the formal cause of any work of art. Always. You cannot have a work of art anywhere at any time for which the audience is not the formal cause. Now, the efficient cause is quite different from the formal cause. And the efficient cause is the only thing we study. Formal cause, the audience as maker, as setting the parameters for any structure in any work of art, is part of this implied form. Formal cause is something that philosophers often mention, have never ever explained. Aristotle doesn't explain it either. He makes much of it but never explains it. He too is an efficient cause man. Alphabetic man specializes in efficient causality, applied knowledge. He is not very good at speculative understanding. Since this offers some opportunities for exploration, why not try another item for the tetrad study? Anybody volunteer an item?
Intertextuality.
All right. What does it enhance? Do tell me. What does it enhance? It enhances some sort of awareness, huh? It enhances the awareness of textuality. What about, and what does it obsolesce then?
Irrelevant social attitudes, I guess.
The extraneous.
It enhances the extraneous?
No.
No?
text.
Well, by enhancing the text, you obsolesce some features. The peripheral, the ambience? Context. All right. It obsolesces context.
No, it obsolesces the isolation of the text.
It obsolesces blue criticism.
What does it retrieve? What does intertextuality retrieve or bring back? That tradition?
Sure.
Group intention, private intention. Private. Brings back, retrieves private intentionality. No? What does it flip into when pushed all the way? When pushed to the limit of the potential it has, what does it flip into?
Literary history.
Huh? You see, anything pushed will flip into a complementary or opposite form.
Can we run the laws of the media through this?
Yes, all media. I've done hundreds of them, and I mentioned money as an example of a popular medium, a highly inflated one. But I may have some samples here, but it's easy to do. What does radio enhance, for example? Simultaneous access to the entire planet. On the air, you're everywhere at the same moment. It obsolesces wires, cables, and physical bodies. Let's think. It retrieves a tribal, ecological, environmental state. It reverses into the global village theater. Everybody is an actor, nobody is a spectator. This is a simple structural aspect of radio.
Let's try elections.
Yes. What does an election enhance? Awareness of parties, policies, awareness of policies. What does it obsolesce? The old party. What does it bring back? New party. What does it flip into? A government. The radio, I mentioned radio, that maybe I went through it too quickly, enhances simultaneous access to entire planet. It doesn't have any locale. Its acoustic space is a space whose center is everywhere, whose margin is nowhere. Radio is acoustic space. Was it Empedocles who said, God is a being whose center is everywhere, whose margin is nowhere?
He didn't know
The voice of God.
He didn't. Remember, they used to think of thunder as the voice of God. What did he say that time? It obsolesces wires, cables, and physical bodies. When you're on the telephone or on the air, you do not have a physical body. What does this do to people? When you're a nobody, what happens to you? Nobodies have a very peculiar state of mind, a very peculiar state of behavior. They become very violent. Nobodies become very violent people. The quest for identity takes the form of violence. That is why we live in extremely violent time. There are so many nobodies about. And people who have lost their bodies physically, who have had them ripped off by technology. However, violence is one feature. Radio retrieves the tribal ecological environment It's an acoustic form, back to the oral form of awareness, and reverses into global village theater, where, like Orson Welles' Invasion from Mars sort of thing, where everybody becomes an actor. There's no audience in the global theater. Everybody is actor, participant. These are little features of the same four-part structure. Every single medium has these they're artifacts, therefore they have these structures.
Have we tried on literature?
I'm sorry?
We tried on literature.
Literature? What does literature enhance? That's shall we say it, the written word? Are you thinking of the written word or the printed word? It's a huge gap between the two. Technologically and as artifact, the written word and the printed word are miles apart. Do you want to take one of those forms, the printed word or the...
Try print.
Try print. The printed word, what does it enhance? Uniformity, the same text for everybody. It's a huge innovation in multiplicity of uniform patterns, repetition. Same text for everybody. For the first time, the written word does not do that. The written word is not the same text for everybody. The printed word, same text for everybody. Everybody becomes a reader. So it obsolesces the special privileged state of literacy. And what does it bring back? Retrieve. What does it retrieve? What type of awareness? Universal, a kind of universal man would seem to and what does it flip into when pushed? We ought to know something about that. We're undergoing it. It's been pushed a long way. Maybe it flips into Xerox. Everybody becomes a publisher. With Xerox, everybody becomes a publisher. With print, everybody becomes a reader. Maybe what is retrieved is the public. The old idea of a public is brought back by print. The public, as understood in ancient times, I'm not sure. But pushed all the way, it would seem to flip into the oral. The Xerox form makes everybody a publisher, which would seem to be a flip from Gutenberg. Anybody want try another example, another word, another technology?
University.
All right, what does university enhance? Community of learning. Community of learning. It's a community that is engaged in a single occupation of learning. What is obsolesced? Private dialogue? Or maybe not. What is obsolesced by the existence of the university? Specialism. What is retrieved? Dialogue. What does the university flip into when pushed? Anarchy. Specialism. tends towards specialism.
Three-part structures into four-part.
The triadic, you could ask, what is the structure, what is the nature of triad? Triads are connected. It enhances connection. The tetrads are discontinuous and simultaneous. The triad by definition is sequential and connected. And so it is worlds away from, that's why Hegelian dialectic is, I would say, completely irrelevant to philosophy. It's purely conceptual. But it's not analogical. But this structure here is analogical, not logical. The four-part structure is analogical, simultaneous analogical. Now, Hegel's connections are imposed naturally. They're not found or discovered, they're imposed, they're conceptualized. Any triadic structure, any dialectic is imposed, is conceptual, is not percept. That
percept or conscious or unconscious?
sorry?
Are they conscious or unconscious percepts?
That's a good question. Are percepts conscious or unconscious? I imagine that they can be both, but the subliminal must be a very, very large part of ordinary perception. In other words, the unconscious factors in perception are vast. Trained perception is an area of consciousness, but just general perception is, I would imagine, almost completely subliminal.
I think very interesting that would it be possible not to have a practical demonstration and see what Ralph Cohen enhances, obsolesces, retrieves, and
Are you talking about Professor Cohen as a person?
No, I think I would like to hear what he has to say, and then we can decide what he has enhanced, obsolesces, retrieves, and
This is a sort of a general field theory, and you can't narrow him down to a single. He doesn't have a theory, does he?
I don't know.
I would say he has a general, very highly developed general awareness.
I think the chair is about to opt its privilege. But I appreciate the proposal that perhaps what Professor Mcluhan has provided us with is a challenge that really should not be directed to Ralph Cohen, but to this colloquium, that the final tetrad to clarify is the subject of our discourse for the past 3 days. But I think it's premature, because indeed Professor Hernadi is correct that Professor Cohen has yet to give us his last word, and we won't even insist that it be his last word. But could I offer you, Professor Mcluhan, a concluding remark before we shift?
No, I'd be happy to just make this transition right now. Over to Professor Cohen.
Will you accept?
As the last formal speaker, before we turn over to you to continue this colloquium, I've been asked, and I see as my responsibility, try to draw some general remarks about the 2 days in which we've been engaged with the problems of literary history. And you will forgive me if, in doing so, I perhaps misinterpret what has been said or misrepresent what has been said, because operating in almost every case from notes, so that there's somebody's notes that I've taken notes on, with the result that the margin there is probably pretty large. I want to begin with the aims of the colloquium, as I understand them. The purpose was to furnish a forum, a way of talking together, a form of engaging one another in dealing with selected problems in the theory of literary history. And this included as well the relation between theory and practice. Now, the very nature of such a colloquium is that it produce no answers, that it create uneasiness, that it create anxiety, that it create unhappiness. It's the nature, as I see it, of the kind of form which is set up so that people should not be able to completely develop positions, because there's only a very limited time in which this can happen, but rather that they should provoke other people to respond to them, and the responses will always be, of course, only partial, with the result that the nature of the enterprise is to create uneasiness, frustration, and at the same time a genuine feeling of our commitment to the study of literary history, a feeling that the problems are worth discussing and worth pursuing, and that despite our sense of uneasiness, unhappiness, anxiety, the feeling that the things that ought to have been said weren't said, and the things that were said were not said in such completion that one could really appreciate, that's the nature of the form in which we're engaged. Now, if we ask what formed the basis for this inquiry, I would say that there certainly seems a need to reconsider what literary history is, because of the developments in literary study in general. Some of these studies are actually studies of literary history, the reception, theories of reception. And therefore, one of the things one has to consider in such a colloquium is the nature of theories of reception, the variety of the theories of reception. The theories about intertextuality in writing. Theories of intertextuality in writing already imply a certain kind of literary history. And therefore the colloquium has to address itself to the nature of this kind of literary history, which seems to me, if I may say so, quite different from the theory of reception. As a result of recent work by Marxist critics and sociological critics and anthropological critics, the cultural implications of literature have been brought to the fore. And the question has arisen whether we need a different way of dealing with the social implications rather than the purely textual implications. So that, as I will be pointing out later on, there seems to me to be in the symposium two very different concepts of intertextuality. One is that intertextuality is a study of privileged texts. And the other is that intertextuality is a study of texts which relate to society. And these are not the same kind of intertextuality. certainly one of the major issues that has repeated itself again and again in this symposium, and one of the reasons for trying to have a study about theories of history, has to do, of course, with developments in the study of readers and reading. Now, hermeneutics is, after all, even though we devoted the session to it, hermeneutics is, after all, only one of the ways in which readings take place. It's one theory of reading. And the question of what exactly is involved in the hermeneutic practice of reading, as I shall try to illustrate, doesn't involve any agreement, so far as I can tell, on the explanations of what happens in the hermeneutic experience. This is precisely what a colloquium is supposed to do. To bring to the fore the different ways in which the same terms are used and expressed, but have quite different implications and fall into quite different theoretical constructs. And what we want to do is to try to see what the nature of these constructs are. Anyone who wishes to engage in a theory of historical interpretation must recognize that there ought therefore to be some kind of theory of a historical interpretation. Now, this has floated up and down in the 2 days that we have been discussing these matters. There has been a historical interpretation and an ahistorical interpretation and a transhistorical interpretation and a transcendent interpretation. Now, here again, that's the purpose of such a colloquium, to bring to the surface the nature of these disagreements. I think we've all been aware of the nature of artistic continuity and discontinuity. What we want to understand in the writing of history is what exactly do we mean by continuity and discontinuity? And of the people who have spoken about continuity and discontinuity, how much agreement can we assume in their notion of historical unfolding? And at this point, I want to bring in the reference to the killing of the father and the return to the uncle, the grandfather. Apparently, the women are out of it. And I want to suggest that this metaphor is an unfortunate metaphor precisely because dying is a form of discontinuity, all right. Murder is a very special form of discontinuity. And it doesn't do us much good to insist that the way in which we want to conceive of discontinuity is always in terms of murder and not in terms of just dying. With regard to not that I want to rule out that murder doesn't exist, nor am I ruling out Frye. What I want to suggest is other modes of talking about discontinuity without these metaphors, and we're not committed to those metaphors, and that we have other options to deal with the same phenomena. What about the rejection of past ways of writing history, the old literary history? We ought at least to be aware of what the old literary history once enhanced and obsolesced and retrieved, because it then flipped into the new literary history. I want to begin by suggesting what I take to be the wise and intelligent ordering of the colloquium, because clearly it has already had upon us these effects of anxiety, uneasiness, objection, and so on. It's precisely what it was supposed to achieve. Plus, I hope, a genuine feeling that the problems with which we are grappling are both very complicated and very important to us. And no one who comes to a colloquium ever expects that those problems will be solved and you'll go home with solutions. We don't expect that. You have a right to expect that the problems are treated in such a way that we confront what we consider the important issues which those problems raise. And I think these have indeed been raised. And I'll try to suggest how I think they have been raised. There were 4 sessions, and there were three papers. The 3 papers dealt with 3 crucial problems pertinent to the backgrounding of the conference. The first paper raised the question of the necessity of historical understanding of literature. I think it's a question, and I shall be coming back to it, but it's a question that leads into who are the readers of literary history. But after all, we must recognize that if you use history in the sense that every reader is historical, in the sense that he lives in a culture, is it not possible that the culture might want to resist past cultures, as you want to destroy past cultures? And therefore, the concept of reading is such that it presupposes that the only use of past documents is to cannibalize them, that is, to use them for the present and not to see them in their pastness. And it's therefore an important issue in the nature of reading to ask whether indeed there is any necessary historical interpretation of literature. Second paper, necessary for us, was to give us a background of the problems of historical approach, and that was the Czech structuralists. We had a sense of the background of some of the problems that were inevitable in the writing of contemporary history and the way in which we deal with the subject of literary history. And the third paper, absolutely necessary in the discussion of literary history, was a practical demonstration of how literary history can operate in terms of a tradition. And therefore it was, in a sense, a demonstration of the writing of literary history before our eyes. The conference was organized in such a way to first deal in the most general way with the concept of literary systems. And insofar as the issue was, is literature a historical institution? The concept was that if literature is to be understood as a system, it inevitably involves a historical conception of what an institution is. And there were 3 versions that were presented. One was that its characteristic as a system with continuities and discontinuities and so forth was to be understood in terms of 3 types of literary language which operated cyclically and which would continue to operate cyclically. The second was that in terms of a system which is itself historical, it operates in terms of the reception, in terms of the effects which literature has upon the audience. And the third was based on a dialectical conception of the concept of history as a generic system with questions about the relation of such systems to the actual writing of literary history. And the interesting thing was that the 3 speakers, Northrop Frye made reference to his work on the Bible, Paul Hernadi to his own book on dramatic reception, Pat Rosenbaum to his own book, Rosenbaum to his own book on the Bloomsbury Group. And so that we were involved from the very beginning of this conference, right, on questions about the large systematic issues and the personal working out of those issues in the way in which one writes literary history. The second meeting dealt with the literary text as a cultural or class-determined object, in which literary history had a place in that it implied relationships between writer and work and reader and work. The nature of those relationships came up time and again in our discussion of the reader. In other words, there is an interlocking of the issues as we moved from section to section. Those issues arose in terms of the kind that even at this session, Millen Dimich raised in terms of, is our notion of the reader's relation to a text as simple as we imply when we talk about a cultural relation or a Marxist relation? Because aren't there, his point was, even more implicit relations which go back to the very education of which we are a part, to our very profession of which we are a part, and thus the way in which we see our relation to a text seems to have such deep roots that it requires more than a meeting at a conference to explore how deeply prejudicial is the way in which we look at texts. If this is so, you can see that the discussion on hermeneutics is going to be fraught with all sorts of problems about the prejudicial nature of the transaction. The next session was devoted to the literary text, which was seen as a sign system or a group of sign systems, in which the signs were to be seen as a privileged literary language or as a non-privileged literary language. As a privileged literary language, intertextuality was clearly a matter of the texts relating to text, but not to the external world. On the other, it was text relating to text in such a way that they clasped the external world. So that there are really two kinds of intertextuality. And it behooves us, I think, if we possibly can, to try to develop a little further the kinds of arguments we would want to raise about these two types of intertextuality. The fourth discussion was a discussion of hermeneutics and literary history. And here, the problems that I already referred to cropped up again in terms of the relation of the reader to the text, in which the basis for the interchange was a recognition of one of the following things. Either of a cultural attempt to create a dialogue between the text and oneself, or of a relation to the text which wasn't dialogic at all, but which saw, in the case of the statue as transcendent. Or the relation between an individual and a text in which the text was wrenched out of its role and became symbolic for one's own uses. All of these are possible, but they do suggest that the concept of the hermeneutic relationship needs further exploration in order for us to grasp which of these aspects we want to talk about. Now, I want to present to you a series of questions that I think come out of the conference. And I think we should, as long as we can, or for as much as we can, discuss them. I've divided them into categories which are pertinent to our discussions. And I'll begin with the concept of the reader as a historical figure, because this seems to have been the starting point for so many of the discussions. These are the questions, I think, that have been coming up again and again, and that before we leave we might try to talk a little further about. Is every reading historical? Is every reading of a text historical? The answer to that is, can there be an ahistorical reading? When we talk of readers as culture conditioned, what exactly is the nature of this conditioning that we are talking about? And what does this have to do with seeing works of the past and reading works of the past as against just reading works of the present, and all the works of the past as all the works of present? As in what sense, in other words, does cultural conditioning permit us, or does it permit us, to see works in their pastness? Are they non-cultural? Or perhaps non-ethnocentric? Or perhaps universal aspects to any reading? Are there, in other words, ahistorical aspects to any reading? Is the hermeneutical encounter so internalized, because we mustn't ever forget that if the reader reads a text, it's the reader who is reading the text and who is explaining the author to himself. Whatever dialogue is engaged is the reader to himself. There is nobody else speaking. I know the book talks back to us, but we decode the language. We discover the questions. Therefore, it seems important to ask if the hermeneutical encounter is so internalized. Is it possible that our internalization cannot remove the reader's concealed prejudices which he imposes on the text? I know we are supposed to create a reading without presuppositions. I think we have to ask, what does it mean to create a reading without presuppositions? In what sense are ideological interests both present in the word and present in the reader? And to what extent, therefore, if they're present in the work and present in the reader, are they in conflict? And therefore, is every reading which we make deliberately, if we are conscious of it, distorting? Now, Fred Jameson, who is here, has argued, and argued very well indeed, that every work, because it creates a unity which imposes upon conflicts, tends to erode the actual conflicts, and that the function of the critic is to make these conflicts of a society which the book is sort of unifying, to make them come to the surface. Thus, the function is to deliberately alter what the book is doing in order to demonstrate that it's concealing, repressing, suppressing what we want to surface in our society. Finally, what about the pleasures of the text? Are they in some way ahistorical? Or are our pleasures, like our pains, conditioned by what we are, and that for each age a different pleasure? The second group of questions belong to the subject matter of literary history. We grant, and everybody who has spoken, I think, grants, that literary history is, after all, a narrative about texts. And everyone, I think, would agree it's a narrative about the interconnection of text, whether it's their intertextuality, whether it's their interrelations of forms, whatever it is, it's a study of the interconnections of texts. Now, this could be either that it's a study of the reception of texts, how they are received, by whom they're received, what we mean by reception. And in the concept of reception, may I now introduce again Marshall McLuhan's statements, because it's an explanation of the nature of reception. That is, the laws of the media, as I see them, are explanations of the ways in which works are received, in the sense that they are, on the one hand, seen as improvements of or developments of other works. They may be combined with them, become more comprehensive. They also reject aspects of previous works. That is, in any concept of reception, we realize that we both receive in terms of enhanced, obsolesce in terms of rejecting certain aspects that we feel not appropriate for the purposes that we are writing history for. Draws attention, as we're all familiar with, to older texts, you retrieve texts that you have to even anticipate, and we have many and valuable examples of this. And then the moment of discontinuity is what I take to be reverse. So that, what does it flip into? What does it become? That moments of discontinuity lead to different conceptual patterns and different kinds of works. I take this to fall within the pattern that we've been speaking about. Now, reception of text raises all sorts of questions about what's involved in the processes of reception. Then there is, in terms of the subject matter for literary history, the analysis of the ideologies of texts. I'm assuming that the kind of history that Fred Jameson and Jerry Legan and Tim Rice were talking about is a history which would involve awareness of that, and that's also a way of writing literary history. And indeed, when Cyrus Hamlin studied the tradition, the tradition of a single feature of a text, or a tradition of sound, we can have a literary history which deals with a single metaphor, a single form, or a group of forms, so that the notion of how we connect them, as what are we connecting with what and why are we connecting with, every connection we'll recognize at once. People have gone on to say such connections involve periods. Now, the nature of periods seemed to me one of the hypothetical assumptions that people are only readily prepared to make without realizing that there are plenty of options without periods. You can have movements. You can trace tendencies. You can merely describe the way in which groups of writers used an image and move on to other groups of writers. If the conference should serve us to understand that the writing of history calls the question about historical periodicity into question, that is, we should at least consider whether there is such a thing as a view which is ideological for a particular period, or whether this concept can be, since there is continuity in literature, is it possible for ideologies to be continued in works of quite different periods? And that the notion that ideologies are in some sense circumscribed by a period is a mistake, because the concept of the period is a mistake to begin with? And how do we go about defining what a period is? And how do we go to locate its coherence? Well, my purpose is, as you know, to add to anxiety and not to answer these questions, but to indicate that in proposing them, I'm extrapolating the kinds of questions that arose and indicating that there is indeed a body of issues of great importance to us in this subject. I have two other areas that has to do with history. One has to do with history, and the other has to do with explanation. But I think I'll stop. I don't wish to take more time. I'll stop, and I'll conclude with what I take to be.
That's a signal for the window. That's it's a little chilly.
I'll conclude with what I take to be the agreements which the participants have, I believe, come to, without in any way indicating that they have so come to such agreements. And I may indeed be misleading in assuming that they would agree upon the following issues. One, that literary texts should be treated as systems, and that systems which are both diachronic and synchronic simultaneously. That authors write texts that are intertextual, leaving aside the nature of this intertextuality. That texts are reconstructed by critics. And that literary history involves the analyses of the systems and the interconnections of systems in which texts are involved. That such history presupposes some cultural or ideological assumptions. And that texts, for all their historicity, are both historical and trans-historical. I think these are the kinds of statements that I, at least, felt there would be agreement upon. And like all agreements, many of the statements may not be readily accepted. But at least they form the basis for the beginning of some historical accommodation.
Could I recognize Professor Valdez?
I want to respond to Professor Cohen and Professor Mcluhan. First, I want to make a general observation about this colloquium. I'm reminded of the phenomenon that occurred in post-war United States, characterized by the cartoon of the archaeologist entering the tomb of Tutankhamun and finding Kilroy was here. Well, for this colloquium, Czech structuralism was here. Characterizes much of our discussion. It has been very enlightening to those of us who have not had access to the Czech text. But Czech structuralism was the Kilroy was here of this colloquium. And I want to respond first to Professor Mcluhan. And the last statement he made was to do perhaps a tetrad of the colloquium. And I think the colloquium, in the best sense of the word, enhances controversy, discussion. Professor Cohen referred to this. It obsolesces isolation, the sense that we are sufficient by ourselves. It retrieves, I think, dialogue as a means of learning. And it flips into, well, at least speaking for myself, into a position that I'm fairly secure with. I, of course, have had the advantage of being involved in this for much more than 2.5 days. And so we have been working on these issues, and we have had the privilege of having Professor Cohen address us all of this month of March. So we have, I think, had an advantage over the rest of you in coming into the colloquium with most of the controversy already in a very fermented stage and ready to move forward to some distillment. My position is one of someone who works in literary theory, but also who is a historist. And I'm concerned with Spanish literary history. And I'm very concerned with the problems that obtain Spanish literary history. I don't claim that they're exclusive to Spanish literature, but I think they have peculiarities. And I am firmly convinced that the best way to approach Spanish literary history is through a history of literary form, as Professor Cohen has defined it. Literary form, and not in the sense of Don Hirsch's Your Sonnet in the Sky, but in the sense of literary form that is changing, combining, developing. And this is one way to retrieve the 18th century, which it doesn't seem to exist in many treatises in Spanish literature. And finally, to conceive of this history of literary form as a strategy aimed at a reader, and work out this combination of history and form. I do not believe that this is simply a pious wish. I believe very strongly that this is a workable, practical approach, and I intend to pursue it in Spanish literary history. Thank you.
The floor is open, and whoever wishes to speak may do so. Professor Rifater.
I would like to say one thing about the two intertextualities mentioned by Professor Cohen. You distinguish between the intertextuality that relates the text to other texts and the one that you would, as I should prefer to see developed, that would relate the text to the outside world. My feeling is that there is no such thing. What we have is an intertextuality that relates to a verbal image of the outside world. A verbal image that you find in the sociolect, in the various codes we use in everyday life, but it is never a direct apprehension of the outside world. It is always through words, through groups of words, through language.
Don't you think that silences form a part, in fact, you were yourself saying that now silences form a part of a literary text. With regard to a dramatic performance, it's not only silences that form a part, but indeed it's the human bodies that move on the stage. It's the visual scene. Those are not words, Michael. Those are not words, but they are indeed part of the way in which we have to pursue our intertextuality.
They are not words, but we think of them, we imagine them, you remember them through words. And the text, any text, if this kind of intertextuality is to work, any text will go through the intermediate units connecting with such forms. We go through the intermediate screen of words.
But you see, my point would be when you have work form or work songs, people are working together. The function of the gestures for rhythm on the railroad, for example, are part of the call it the acting out of the poem. And those are not verbal. And I don't think that when you see a performance, you convert the body which is moving on stage into words. You actually see human forms, and you see gestures, and there is indeed a way of interpreting gesture which is different from a way of interpreting words. And I would think that certainly in any kind of poetry which involves group sharing, and any kind of drama which involves group sharing, we are not able to limit it just to the words. And in fact, we do not.
Professor Hernadi.
I am much intrigued with two possibilities of writing literary history. One, to try to base it on a sequence of texts which at one time or another, for one reason or another, were considered literary. And another one would be to base it on a sequence of words which, for some reason or other, hopefully intelligent and shareable reason, I now consider literary. And it seems to me that the best of both worlds would be achieved if I could come up with some principle which do not only satisfy my present requirements of conceptualizing what I feel I and those people whose opinion I value consider literary, but some kind of sequence of texts which could then be included there, which by the overwhelming majority of previous people whose opinions I value were also considered literary. And not so much in order to remind you that I was suggesting two principles which might help us classify our response to dramatic works, entertainment and commitment, and to plug this as a possibility of saying what literature is. Namely, literature then would be texts which in significantly important combinations entertain and commit us. But rather to indicate that by these two categories we can show what is not literature, I would like to suggest that the 0 degree of entertainment is boredom, and the 0 degree of commitment is indifference. And I certainly think that in the entire history of criticism, as far as I can now recall it, no one ever was suggesting that literary works should bore us or leave us indifferent. And somehow it would seem that some kind of a concept of literary history could be proposed, which would exclude works which, by contemporary standards or by what we feel are adequate standards with hindsight, should result in boredom or indifference.
The quantity is running down very drastically. The quantity.
Tim Rice.
Everything is falling.
Brief comment
And on the other, newspaper can be.
It seems to me this one is going to restrict intertextuality to one kind rather than two, as our forum is suggesting. And focusing how it is really possible to consider that a work, the intertextuality of a work, is entirely conceivable in terms of an internal literary history. So that one can set aside all the socio-historical relationships that are clearly involved, even in a study of a text such as Mcluhan did yesterday. It strikes me that when he is referring back to Baudelaire's poem, he is not in fact doing so merely in terms of a literary history as he claims to be doing. So
Brian Stock, then Juris Peter.
Something agree with Professor Cohen. Again, I'm speaking as a historian, but it seems to me that if you take an event like the First Crusade, which we know only from a group of privileged texts, some of them with a very fine reputation in literary history, what really happened is that the crusade unfolded as they were on the crusade, and that it was only later that the pattern of actual events had been shaped in their minds and in their experience, that this group of privileged texts with a high degree of intertextuality appeared, and again reshaped men's experience of the crusade, so that in a sense, if one goes back to experience, again, the question which I raised is the status of the text within the experience. And those experiences, I don't think are entirely, they're ritualistic sometimes, they're symbolic, they have various other dimensions of expressing themselves. And in a way, I think what you're dealing with is that later stage. I agree with you, the later stage, yes, that's what's happening. But what about all these other things? And some of them mentioned as you said, by Fred Jameson, who wasn't here when actually this paper. Even if one doesn't see them in ideological form, they're still happening.
Professor Streeter?
Can I come back again to the problem of what Ralph Cohen called the two types of intellectuality, and at the same time on the example Professor Image brought as one of his examples to Don Quixote. I think Don Quixote shows different kinds of intertextuality in his text and in his reception in different countries. And I think, of course, knowing how much Kulturkämpfe and cultural tradition in different countries modified the perception of this novel, it is clear that in the novel itself we have an explicit intertextuality referring to the tradition of Amadeus. And I think that in this case it was not simply a different culture, but simply the oblivion, this literary tradition, with the Amadist tradition, which changed the whole reference. What remained was precisely what was shown in the text itself. That was enough. People reading Don Quixote were not historically educated enough to know the Amadist tradition. They knew precisely as much as was in Don Quixote, but this made the novel able to be transposed in other traditions, in the German one, in the Russian one, and so on. And the very moment that happened, it was not an ahistoricity, but just the opposite. The text could connect now with other traditions. You mentioned, for instance, the Hamlet tradition, or, for instance, the situation of German idealism. You, Don Quixote, read books and becomes an idealist, with all the positive and negative aspects, and the other will be the Sancho-Panza. That means it became a figure in the German idealistic fight. The same through German idealism transposed to Russia, this totally different social and economical tradition, meant we, the privileged nobility, reading books, including Don Quixote and so on, are well educated, but what can we do? We can fight against windmills. Here we have no real task here. We are superfluous men. And that was the reason why for Turgenev, for instance, who showed this in Russian society, Don Quixote and Hamlet became the basic types he could show that. Whereas Russian Marxists said, that's precisely this structure what made Russian superfluous man Don Quixote, and Don Quixote in Russia a symbol for superfluous man. But then came a revolution, and one of the most interesting, now in France, rediscovered, and step by step I hope in Russia, to rediscovered revolutionary utopian novel, the Cherenkov of Platonov, introduced as a symbol of a continuous, unfinished revolution, the revolutionary Don Quixote, whose horse is called not Rocinante, but proletarian power, and whose Dulcinea is Rosa Luxemburg. And he's always going to her name, and he's right, but he is only the one type, because that's the utopia of the past, whereas the other utopia is the one of the established utopian town of Cherengur, the town. So here you have again the possibility of a generalized text to apply very directly to changing social, cultural tradition. And I would say, I agree with you that that's not simply a problem of referring to other texts, but referring to other texts. You can always reinterpret it. And of course, the figure of Don Quixote is not a figure of literature anymore. I heard it, of course, orally. Russian has still an oral tradition, even telling about literature, but nevertheless, of course, verbal systems made possible, and literature made possible, to transform such a figure. And that was what I meant. Maybe Ralph misunderstood us in the discussion before. I was not speaking about universals, but about generalizing works of literature, figures of literature, devices of literature in a way which makes it able that literary work, figures, genres, forms, and so on, can work in different contexts. And that's, in this respect, I think that intertextuality in a very strict intraliterary sense is always intertextuality in a wider historical, social, even in some respect political form.
It should be mentioned, Professor Streeter, that the musical comedy, The Impossible Dream, is now playing in Toronto, so that one can continue your story. Professor Rifater.
If I may, I will return to the moment when Professor Cohen's reply to my remarks reduced me to mournful silence. I have brainstormed since. I would like to say that what you described as non-text and still an object of intertextuality is indeed that in text you have certain ritualistic systems, but they are not really texts. They have not reached the level of the text. They don't have the permanence of the text. Perhaps we should redefine or try to be clear about the definition of the text. I would personally define the text as something you can reread, and in the case of an oral text, something that you can remember, either by rereading or through the agency of memory. You have something you can refer to. And that is a text with also a beginning and an end, clearly defined by similar features, possibly recurring features. And of course, the permanent features of the text are structural items, which means that they can be actualized either in conformity or against the rules of a given structure, but that should be the limits of the text.
I would say that I don't think that this would in any way invalidate the argument about the drama, which would always require bodies in order to perform, and which would require. But this is the point I want to make, that if you're going to eliminate the concept of the performance of works of art, you eliminate not only the drama from literature, but you eliminate the early forms which are always connected with ritual group behavior, and in which the actual movement of the people participating are seen as necessary for the actualizing of the song itself. After all, we mustn't be misled by the concept of text as to mean only writing. After all, as I understand it, the whole point about the text was to diffuse the notion of privileged language. So you want not to talk about literary work, you want to be able to talk about any written work, and therefore use the term text. In other words, the purpose of it was to broaden our discussion, not to narrow it. And I think if we use it that way, Michael, we tend to narrow it.
Then I didn't make myself clear. When I spoke of a text that can be reread through the agency of memory, I meant oral text. So I certainly didn't mean to eliminate the oral forms of text, including the more, let's say, primitive, quote-unquote, forms of literature. But I still believe that the performance, and I was not trying to eliminate at all the voiced aspect of the text, whatever you read aloud, for instance. But the performance is something, it's a second operation. It's already beyond a basic hermeneutic procedure. It's something like an acting out of the text. And it seems to me that it is not the letter of the text, letter being understood as oral or written, of course. It is already a superstructure, super-added, superimposed by those who perceive it. It's the reader. In other words, you have the text on the one hand and the reader on the other hand, and performance belongs.
Well, I won't pursue this because I don't want to take up too much time, but I'll merely say that when Aristotle lists the characteristics of tragedy, song and spectacle are not considered as superfluous, that it is dispensable. They are all seen as part of the organic unfolding of this plot. And I don't think that one can argue that only the words are indeed what he's talking about, and the other things are really things superfluous. What's more, I would say that all the forms of intertextuality that you have reference to apply, of course, to the way performances are indeed given, and that the concept of performance includes the text. It includes the text, and there's no reason why we should limit the textuality just to it.
The chair will recognize first Professor Dimich, and then Jeffrey Hartman, and then David Hoy, right?
No, I wanted only to add to this discussion that it seems to me that perhaps the term you are using for performance is something which comes later, which is superimposed and so on, would create serious historical difficulties with medieval drama, with the drama up to Shakespearean times, with the Commedia dell'arte, where it seems whatever was written down was to help them memorize performances and patterns, but what really counted was the performance that came, creatively speaking and even chronologically speaking, before the holding down on paper or whatever they wanted to jot down. So that as late as Shakespearean times, as we know, manuscripts and then the printed versions were more what was being prepared by actors and for actors so that they can move from one day's performance to another, but not the absolute goal. In other words, the performance would not be a subsequent stage, but the primary stage in that historical sense. I'm perhaps misinterpreting your thought when you said it's something which comes then, which is superimposed and so on.
That if Kilroy was here and Kilroy is identified as a Czech structuralism, then Hegel also should be playing Kilroy to some extent. But the more I think about it, the more hard it is for me to introject Hegel, even though I keep trying in my mind how I'm going to do it. When Lefebvre talked about remembrance or certain features being repeated, I thought for a moment I could bring back Hegel. When I heard Kilroy was here, and I thought, well, we might as well change the allegory and have Hegel instead of Czech structuralism, I realized that I was dealing with two permanent features, or what seemed to be like permanent features. One is a kind of epigram, and the second was allegorical substitution. Now, what is unclear to me is still, again, the relation of what we call permanent features to the more dynamic process, which I think, Mcluhan is just, he takes on. Mcluhan is just wrong in thinking that Hegel is irrelevant here. His relevance to what I think Cohn and Lefebvre and so on were saying in the question of intertextuality and whether there are two types of intertextuality is surely that when we talk about language, when we conceive of language, of words, our words change in which we talk, when we talk about words, there is a context that is not purely verbal, a context of situation, as sometimes we call, in which we talk about words. But that context of situation cannot be identified as non-verbal either, because we are mediated at this point, so Hegel would say, by words. It is true that Hegel hierarchizes things. He thinks that the stage in which we see things through words is a higher stage than previous stages, and that I don't know whether that is correct.
I don't know whether Hegel thought about visual space. Visual space is an artifact. It's not a normal space. It is a peculiar artifact that he uses everywhere in dialectic. It is obsolesced now by the speed of light with the Einsteinian thing. Visual space has been obsolesced as an artifact. And this has transformed all our ways of thinking and feeling. But anyway, that's what I was referring to. I was just obliquely, in passing, referring to Hegel as an example of a triadic structure. And I wasn't trying to prove anything at that point.
You introduced obsolesce, which is itself a strange word, but which one can understand, perhaps better than sublated, say. It has a kind of colloquiality. I suppose, without going into these details, not very important, that in the Hegelian system, whatever one may think of it as a system, everything is shown eventually to be a construction, what you call an artifact of the mind, which reveals the mind to itself and to us. So I don't know what real differences there are between what you're saying and Hegel is saying. I was just trying to point out that it is almost impossible not to introduce some sort of historical sequence, perhaps more tightly concatenated than Mcluhan would have it, because indeed there are triadic connections. It is both simultaneous and evolving through these connections, and that when we get to the point of verbal consciousness, then this does include prior stages, whether or not verbal consciousness is a higher form of consciousness or not. Now, this is something very simple that one can say, and I don't know how in the actual interpretation of literature, say, or in the writing of literary history, this should work itself out. But I feel unhappy. You wanted to make me unhappy about it. I do feel I'm happy that we seem to come back again and again to the question. It's not a question of referentiality. We seem to be stacked with the scandal of referentiality, almost that I begin to think it's a kind of religious question. You know, was there a historical Jesus? Is there a historical word? You know, do we have real reference? And do we have to come back again and again? Is that a necessary kind of rock in our thought? Do we have to stumble over this question all the time? Is that one of the necessities, like historical reflection may seem to be a necessity?
If you're asking to what extent I would be willing to, for myself, talk about transhistorical responses, I would have to, in answer to that, go back to the nature of words. And if you'll give me, I'll go back to this whole inquiry about referentiality and non-referentiality by saying the use of language involves not only the brain but the whole nervous system. It involves us in a series of actions, many of these that have relatively little to do with the sounds that come out of our mouths finally. That whole notion that one can construct verbal systems as though they're merely verbal systems without realizing that at the source of this system lies a whole basis of responsive a network of both verbal and non-verbal responses that are going on in your body, and they're not non-verbal, they're certainly non-verbal. The operations of the nervous system are non-verbal. And those responses are precisely the responses that trigger the memory you are talking about. They cause me to doubt the notion that if we merely trace the words, we can really trace the kinds of implications that words have for us, because they are not merely in words. Therefore, there must always, it seems to me, be available in us a sense that the network of words that we trace are not a proper demonstration of the kinds of implications that go into, whether it's conditioning, whether it's the sense of our deep-rooted prejudice is so deep-rooted that we don't even know how they have begun to operate within us. And the sounds that we utter or the words that we put down on paper are merely, so to speak, the end result of a whole series of processes. And therefore, when one begins to talk of the nonverbal relations which are necessary for a discussion of intertextuality, one is talking about the way in which the words that we put down are intimately tied to a whole series of nonverbal processes. And this is what disturbs me in the discussion of single view of intertextuality. With regard, therefore, to the fact that responses will recur, these seem to me to be responses that have such deep roots. They look to us like transhistorical responses, because they're so deep in us that it looks as though we are already saying what has been said before. But the interesting thing about language is that no matter whether you translate Chekhov into English, or whether you translate an English book into Chinese, and whether people will respond to Chekhov in English, what is at issue is the kind of experiential quality that goes into the words and lies behind them, and that in Russia it has quite a different effect, and there is no corresponding effect in this country. The fact that you respond to something in it may be very interesting, may be valuable. My point is, Jeffrey, that the ways in which words are tied to their sounds, to the way words are put into a poem, so that the forms of the poem are almost always in contradiction to what the words are saying. This kind of network, this kind of non-verbal element behind the words, so that every word we utter is also non-verbal. And in that respect, I would say yes, in the sense that whatever words that are uttered or written, there are always behind those words, whether we get back into the questions about meaning, or whether we get back into the question of the ways in which meanings get into human beings. There are always areas that elude us. There are always areas that we can't explain why it is that we love certain metaphors, or why it is we love to play with certain metaphors, or why it is that this is the right moment for an act of wit. I wish I had it. This is the right moment. Why is it the right moment? It's not some of the sources that I'm trying to suggest of words and the way in which we use words what I would say is what you're getting at in terms of the continuity of the limited response which words possess. And that would explain for me my insistence at the opening of the intertextuality. I wanted to be open, and I wanted to relate to
I'm not retreating.
I know you're not.
I have noted the interest in making comments by David Hoy, by Jerry McGann, by Brian Stock. Are the three of you still, as it were, in line? Could we proceed in that order?
Let me just make a small point. I worry a little bit about what you just said because it sounds to me like kinds of theories of language that Wittgenstein found it very hard to.
Could you speak up?
It's kind of very hard to accept what you're saying because it makes us think of the kinds of theories of language that immediately preceded Wittgenstein, in which and I don't know whether you mean to go back to those views about experience being the basis for language or not. I guess I think that I'd rather not think that the issue between you and Griffith-Terre was some kind of quarrel about nominalism versus naturalism, which is what it sounds like. I mean, I don't see why he's forced to into a kind of language idealism or anything. I don't think he wants to relate to that. It just, I mean, there just does seem to be a logical point that, going back to your performance question, there must be a difference between performance and what is performance of. It's not. I don't know what more to say, but he is, of course, really just relying on that logical point. So, and he's just trying to, I think, limit the concept to that, not saying that everything's intertextual. So I don't know really that he's in opposition to what you were saying, but I mean, the claim doesn't have to be that there are no events that are just I don't think he's committed to that kind of position. That would be a position. I mean, there clearly are differences. It's just a question of what we can talk about within a particular disciplinary matrix. The disciplinary matrix, in this case, the normal science, would be what he's doing with that kind of semiotics that we're working out there.
But
So
it's just limiting.
Matrices here is what I'm saying.
Well, but his matrix is just a text, and therefore that's the issue, because intertextuality can involve certainly the concept of performance, in which concepts of acting, concepts of stage, and so on are just as intertextual, that is, rely upon other ways of performing, bringing them into this way, into your own present way of dealing with it. And unless you see the drama as a single thing, rather than that you have the notion of people speaking the word and something added to it, you get a strange view of what a text is in terms of drama.
I was thinking, for instance, of the York cycle, of the Chester cycle, and similar performances, which obviously would qualify as systems and traditions, and were still, it seems, from what we know today, the main part was not put down as a text in that narrow sense of an article.
Jerry McGann?
In a way, this is a comment Mr. Professor is on. That's out of the way. But I still think I want to make it on this question of the permanent features of the text. First, person who works in philology or any primary materials, bibliography, and things like that, the more you work in it, that is, in the field where the most permanent features of the text seem to be most apparent, it just convinces you more and more of the problem, the ambiguity of the permanent features of the text, sort of core. It's not really, doesn't sort of put you into a kind of conceptual world, but you begin to see that the two versions, for example, of Keats's La Belle Dame sans Merci have a very specific historical process of production and reproduction. And certain specific editions choose one text, and other editions do not. And the text is not, in historical fact, settled. And this is true for every text I've ever worked on in that sort of a way. The text doesn't have, in the sense that Professor Repetera seemed to be suggesting, permanent features. It has them only historical. The other thing I want to say was something about, in response to Jeffrey, about this referential scandal. If it's a scandal to think of language as having functions and purposes, then there is a scandal. But that's really the answer to this referential and non-referential difference.
I wonder if we've come to the point of departure. I sense a sequence of disappearing acts at the back of the room, which probably is only a sign of another kind of text, which has to do with the airport. But I also think perhaps some of us would welcome adjournment to lunch, and in fact adjournment. I have in mind, excuse, yes?
I just want to interrupt you with one observation, not to interfere with lunch. But it seems to me if the program in Comparative Literature is thinking along lines of further colloquia, it's the discussion that's been taking place here which suggests very clearly one of the directions that another colloquia might take on the nature of language and literature, which would involve certainly philosophical points of view, linguistic points of view, things like that. It seems to me there is a real movement here toward clarity in that particular area, and I know some of you have been thinking about possibilities for future colloquia. Indeed.
It's on tape, your comment. I would be inclined to go one step further towards a generalization in sympathy with Ralph Cohen's remark that a colloquium like this aggravates as much as it resolves. It obviously brings into some kind of public awareness also issues that seem to be important. I'm inclined to think they are important, for us at least. And if there have not been any solutions or any answers, I'm sure that need not disturb us. Perhaps the opposite. It might even provoke us to get back to work. And let's hope that there will be such colloquia again. I think that this university needs all the dialogue it can get, and it is always remarkable to me how much stimulation can be provided by bringing a number of people together, not necessarily as friends, though indeed the congeniality is reassuring too, but for purposes of confrontation and exchange. And I'm even inclined to think that that is part of what we call literary history. And I hope there will be monuments or documents that emerge from all of this. I think we can at least count on a book from Ralph Cohen, and perhaps publications from others among us. Why not from all of us, if we can do it? That's a good sign, surely. But I would also hope that in a more productive form of exchange, which doesn't monumentalize itself with a sense of completion, that is in the classroom or in just the ventures of education and criticism and speaking that presumably make up our verbal existence, that we can carry on with some of the issues that have arisen here. And on that, perhaps I might suggest adjournment to lunch. Thank you.